Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Palmetto State, a place that has some of the most serene beaches I've ever seen in the country, hence the jellyfish shirt. I am talking about South Carolina. South Carolina in recent years has become a bit of a tourist destination with beach communities like Charleston, Myrtle Beach, and Hilton Head. It's also a major producer of tea and peaches, actually producing more peaches than Georgia. The state also has a bit of a sordid history. It was the first state to secede from the Union preceding the American Civil War, as well as the state that had the first battle fought in that same war at Fort Sumter. I also learned recently that South Carolina has a very odd and somewhat outdated law regarding traffic intersections. When approaching a blind four-way intersection in a motor vehicle, one must fire a gun 100 feet from the intersection to warn horse traffic that you are coming. I'm sure those horses weren't spooked at all by those gunshots. Although South Carolina's economy has changed over the years, its politics have been pretty steady going back for at least a few decades. It currently has 7 congressional House districts, and really of those 7, there's only one that's competitive at all. The current balance of power in those districts is 5 Republicans to 2 Democrats. The 2 districts with Democratic leadership as of now are South Carolina's 1st and South Carolina's 6th. Only one of these 2 districts is going to be competitive in November, and South Carolina's 6th has a partisan lean of plus 19 into the Democratic column, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index. So this section will be focusing entirely on South Carolina's 1st district, which was won by Democratic Representative Joe Cunningham in 2018. This district covers much of South Carolina's coastline, going from north of Charleston all the way down to the border with Georgia. It also has a partisan lean of plus 10 into the Republican column when compared to the national average. Despite this fact, a Democrat was able to flip the seat in 2018. As I mentioned before, Joe Cunningham won by just over 1%, I believe. It actually marked the first time a Democrat would represent that district since 1981. As many of us already know, though, 2018 saw a pretty remarkable Democratic turnout, which pushed Cunningham over the edge in flipping this seat. But will he be able to do it a second time come November? Let's pull up our first line graph and figure that out. So here you're looking at raw voter turnout numbers for House candidates in the state of South Carolina. As you can see, Republicans have held a pretty consistent gap every election cycle until you get to 2016, when Donald Trump, of course, defeated Hillary Clinton in the presidential election. That year saw a particularly good turnout from Republicans in the state. The gap between Republicans and Democrats increased. But then going into 2018, you see the size of that gap recede to about the same amount that it was earlier in the decade. And this isn't due to both parties going back to the amount of turnout they were having in those earlier years. Rather, it's because Democrats increased their turnout compared to previous midterm elections. So in South Carolina, you have this overall picture of both parties gaining enthusiasm as we move from one election cycle to the next. But Republicans just aren't letting up and letting Democrats catch up to them. So then we have to wonder, okay, going into 2020, is Joe Cunningham going to be able to retain his narrowly won seat with margins like these? Well, consider the fact that the district is plus 10 into the Republican column according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index, and the fact that Republican turnout is increasing every 2 years by about 4,000 more votes than Democrats. Bearing all this in mind, I don't think that Cunningham is going to win his seat for a second time. More likely than not, he'll lose by about, I'll say 3%. This means the balance of power in South Carolina in the House moves from 5-2 in the Republicans' favor to 6-1 in Republicans' favor. So now we have the results for the U.S. House in South Carolina. Let's make it official and put it on our first map. Mark it. So we've seen South Carolina give up 1 House district to the Republican Party. Now it's time to look into the Senate election. Incumbent Republican Senator Lindsey is running for his 4th term in the state. Although Graham has been a senator in the state since 2002, his political career actually began in the early 90s when he ran for the House of Representatives in the state. Graham first won the seat for South Carolina's 2nd District in 1992, the same year that Bill Clinton won his first term as president. Then one election cycle later, Graham runs in South Carolina's 3rd and wins that seat in 1994, which he holds until he becomes senator 8 years later. Graham has also received criticism from both sides of the aisle at different points over the last few years. Back in 2015, when Republicans were courting the American public for the nomination for president that year, Lindsey Graham was an outspoken critic of current President Donald Trump. In the years since then, Graham has certainly receded into Trump's corner. A select group of so-called never-Trumper Republicans were highly critical of Graham when he refused to defend his late friend John McCain from attacks from President Trump. Facing Graham in this year's election is a man named Jaime Harrison. Harrison is the former chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party and has been gaining some momentum in this race. So we already know that Republicans turn out in higher numbers than Democrats in the state for House candidates, but does Harrison have some kind of edge with his turnout ratio? Well, let's bring up those numbers and find out. And the answer to that question is a resounding no. Over the last decade, Democratic senatorial candidates have received a lower vote count than the total votes cast for Democratic House candidates. The lowest point for Democrats, as you can see, was in 2010, when the ratio was at a mere 67%. However, we see a steady increase in that ratio over time. The question then becomes, does that rate of increase continue into this year? When we look at the Republicans' ratios, we see 107.56%, dropping down to 91 and then back up to 105. So we see them generally keeping it at or around 100%. In predicting the outcome of this election, we also look at the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case Lindsey Graham, who is, as of this video, enjoying approximately a plus 12 net positive approval rating. So now we look to Pollbot to take all those numbers and give us a prediction for the outcome of the Senate race for 2020. And we see Senator Lindsey Graham winning for a 4th time in the state of South Carolina by about 16% of the vote. The consistent turnout advantage that Republicans have in the state, coupled with Graham's net positive approval and, let's say, an uncertain senatorial to House turnout ratio, means that he will win again. So sorry, Jaime Harrison, you ran a good campaign, but now we have to make it official and put it on our next map. Mark it. And now we look to the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and likely Democratic challenger Joe Biden. South Carolina is a state that has voted for a Republican every year since 1980. I believe the last Democratic president to receive votes from South Carolina was Jimmy Carter in '76. Coming back closer to the present, though, we see a state that went for Mitt Romney over Barack Obama by about 10%, and then for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton by about 14%. So Republicans have been increasing their margin of victory this decade. What's important to note about South Carolina, though, is that it is the state that this year gave Joe Biden his momentum back. During the Democratic primaries in the state, voters went heavily for Joe Biden over then frontrunner Bernie Sanders. So Biden clearly has some amount of sway in the state. But let's also consider Donald Trump's approval rating, which as of this video is at a net positive of plus 12. The last thing we have to look at before making our calculations is the presidential to House turnout ratio, which we can bring up right now. So actually what we're seeing now is an advantage in the Democratic corner. These numbers show us that Democratic presidential candidates in the state of South Carolina are likely to receive more votes than the total of all the Democratic House candidates running in the state. Knowing that Republicans generally turn out in higher numbers in the state of South Carolina, we have to figure whether or not this 10 to 15 point ratio advantage will mean anything to Joe Biden. For that, we turn to Pollbot. Pollbot, can you crunch those numbers, please? And there we have our answer. The presidential to House ratio advantage that Joe Biden has will not mean much. I have Donald Trump winning the state of South Carolina by approximately 17%, which is still an improvement beyond 2016. Republicans just have the advantage in numbers, and Trump has the advantage in approval, which means he will carry it for a second time. So now let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So we have Donald Trump winning South Carolina again, we have Lindsey Graham winning South Carolina again, and we have one flip in the Republicans' favor in the House. Now it's time to talk about the future of South Carolina's politics. Let's bring up an old line graph and two new ones and get into this. Looking at the voter turnout for the US House elections that I was showing you earlier, we see positive slopes for both parties. Specifically, we see an increase of 49,700 voters for Republicans every 2 years. Compare that to the Democrats' increase of 45,300 voters every 2 years, and you have two parties that are generally increasing at a pretty close rate. And now if we look at these estimated slopes for the rate of increase or decrease in senatorial to House vote ratios and presidential to House vote ratios, we can see that Democratic senatorial candidates are starting to get more votes relative to the House candidates in the state. This does not necessarily mean that in the next Senate election in South Carolina we will be seeing a Democrat pick up the seat, because these values are relative, of course, to the raw voter turnout for House candidates. And as I just mentioned, Republicans are still increasing that gap very slowly. The senatorial to House voter ratio would have to be much, much higher for Democrats in order for them to flip a Senate seat. Looking at the presidential to House vote ratio, we see decreases for both parties. And because those slope values for Democrats and Republicans are almost equal to each other, this data yields no significant results. South Carolinians are going to continue to vote for presidential candidates in the way that they have for the past decade at least. My ultimate consensus on South Carolina is that for the time being, it is still continuing to become slightly more Republican. And that just about does it for this episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw here, please hit that subscribe button so you can get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload new videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I post on that account which state I'm going to be covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, and thank you for voting. See you next time.